Dune Part 2 is coming out in a few weeks' time, and for some reason, I'm not quite seeing the excitement online that I would expect for potentially one of the greatest sci-fi films to come out over the last few decades. Perhaps this lack of hype is because the movie has been delayed multiple times due to COVID and the writer and actor strikes. Whatever the reason may be, I truly believe that Dune Part 2 could be better than Star Wars. And no, I'm not talking about the terrible sequels or the opinion-splitting prequels. I believe Dune Part 2 has a good chance of rivaling the original Star Wars movies, and being right in a mix for the best sci-fi movie of all time.
Deal with this prophet. Send assassins.
Fade Rother. He's psychotic.
Dune Part 1 had some incredible talent in front and behind the camera, and all of this Oscar-winning cast and crew are returning for Part 2, with the additions of Christopher Walken, Florence Pugh and Austin Butler, as well as Zendaya playing more of a central role. Part 2 is chock-a-block with fantastic actors and actresses. On top of those already mentioned, it's got Timothée Chalamet, Rebecca Ferguson, Javier Bardem, Josh Brolin, Dave Bautista and Stellan Skarsgård, which is a ridiculously impressive list. Now there are movies with great casts that turn out to be terrible films. Amsterdam, for example, with Christian Bale, Margot Robbie, Brad Pitt, Michael Shannon and Robert De Niro. And yet the film was an absolute disaster. So yes, Dune Part 2 does have a great group of actors, but that alone doesn't necessarily mean that Dune Part 2 will be a good film. More than just a cast, what a movie needs, of course, is a good script, a good director, a good cinematographer, and a good composer. Dune Part 2 doesn't just have a good technical cast, it's got one of the best in the business. Three-time Oscar nominee Denis Villeneuve is such a reliable director, with Sicario, Arrival, Blade Runner 2049 and Prisoners all under his directorial belt. Villeneuve also has a clear love for Frank Herbert's books, which weirdly enough seems to be a rarity these days for a director to actually love the source material they're adapting. Anyway, Villeneuve is certainly an A-tier director. Hans Zimmer is also returning to score Part 2, and I kind of feel like even casual movie audiences know who Hans Zimmer is. If you don't, then just think of any blockbuster movie you've seen over the last 20 years, and Zimmer probably composed the score. Greg Fraser returns as director of photography for Part 2. Rogue One, The Mandalorian, The Batman, and The Creator are all films in which Fraser was a cinematographer. So again, a master of his craft. This quality in front and behind the camera gives me such confidence that Dune Part 2 really will be an epic movie in terms of its screenplay, visuals, acting, and directing.
Your blood comes from dukes and great houses. Here, we're equal.
Part 2 has the benefit of being the middle film in a Dune trilogy, and yes, it will be a trilogy, more on that later. Typically, the second film in a 3-part movie series is the best. Just to name a few examples, Empire Strikes Back, The Dark Knight, and The Two Towers. Perhaps this is the case due to the second act normally involving the most action, or because the universe, the characters, and their motives have already been established in the first movie. Or perhaps it's because the actors know their characters and the world they're set in much better by the second film. And for Dune Part 2's case, all of these factors are in place. In Part 2, we'll see characters that have already been introduced in Part 1 deal with much more complex scenarios and higher stake battles. Villeneuve has even said as much, saying, "For me, this film is much better than Part 1. There's something more alive in it. There's a relationship to the characters. I was trying to reach for an intensity and a quality of emotions that I didn't reach with Part 1, and that I did reach with Part 2. Now I do understand that some, even many, view Dune Part 1 as a tad boring and quite slow. I'm a fan of sci-fi, world building, and I enjoy the setup as much as the payoff, so perhaps I'm a bit biased in my love for Part 1, as it was everything I wanted it to be. Fantastic, poignant build-up with awesome cinematography and world building, especially during the first hour, going from Caladan to Gedi Prime, then to Arrakis. Seeing ships take off, and armies gather. To me, it was pure cinematic, storytelling beauty. But for those who weren't blown away by the first instalment of the Dune trilogy, I'd argue that Dune Part 2 is still an absolute must-watch. From the small clips we've seen in the trailers, it's safe to say that the scope and scale of Part 2 is going to dwarf Part 1. The first Dune served as the introduction into Frank Herbert's universe, setting up the characters, the different political houses, Paul Atreides' powers, and a little bit of his romantic interest with Zendaya's character, Chani. Part 2 will pay off all of these aspects that were introduced in Part 1. There is also going to be a hell of a lot of action in Part 2. The film has got so many battles and action sequences to adapt from the book. If you've read the Dune book, or have seen David Lynch's 1984 Dune movie, then you know that Dune Part 1 barely covers 40% of Frank Herbert's novel, which means that there's a lot of action and drama that's been pushed from Part 1 into Part 2. A few days ago, film journos got the chance to see Dune Part 2 early, and the subsequent spoiler-free reviews back up my confidence in this movie being an epic. One journalist said, Dune Part 2 is a riveting action-packed epic, Two Towers level mastery of battle sequences. Another said, Part 2 ups the ante of Part 1 in almost every way. And finally, Dune Part 2 is impressively large in scope and rarely lets up in intent. This is Denis Villeneuve's guerrilla war film, just done on an epic science fiction level. To compare Part 2 to Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers, I think is a fair and very exciting comparison to make. In Fellowship of the Rings, there were a few minor skirmishes, and then in Two Towers, we have the 40-minute long Helm's Deep battle. In Part 1, we had the Harkonnen ambush of House Atreides, and in Part 2, we can expect a similar huge sprawling battle to rival Helm's Deep, as the remains of House Atreides, led by Paul, enact revenge on House Harkonnen.
Well, I'd very much like to be equal to you.
Maybe I'll show you the way.
Dune Part 1 came out on October the 22nd in 2021, which is also around the time that my government, the UK government, imposed a second lockdown, where we were all stuck indoors. So Dune had about a 1-week theatrical run in the UK, and this lockdown approach was of course not just limited to my country. On top of this, Warner Bros, in their infinite wisdom, decided to release Dune on its streaming service, HBO Max, a few hours before its theatrical release. So considering that you could watch a movie at home for cheaper, and that's if you were even allowed to go to the cinema at the time, it's no wonder that Dune's box office was majorly affected by COVID. Dune Part 1 made just under 400 million at the box office, which is actually really good, considering that literally everything was stacked against the movie's release. Dune Part 2 faces no such difficulty, and the excitement, hype, and positive word of mouth, I believe, will mean that Part 2 can potentially more than double Part 1's box office. This means that Part 2 can gather momentum critically and financially, and thus be watched by so many more people than Part 1 was. So Part 2 will benefit from the setup of the first movie, while also enjoying the buzz and publicity that Dune Part 1 was unable to have.
It's okay. I'm here. It's been a while since you've had one of those nightmares.
As mentioned earlier, this movie is part of the Villeneuve Dune trilogy. Part 2 will conclude the events of Frank Herbert's 1965 novel, and Part 3 will be an adaptation of Herbert's follow-up book, Dune Messiah. Denis Villeneuve had this to say about Part 3. Dune Messiah was written in reaction to the fact that people perceived Paul Atreides as a hero, which is not what Frank Herbert wanted to do. My adaptation of Dune is closer to his idea that it's actually a warning. The second one, movie, will definitely be more visual and less dialogue driven, and hopefully there will be another film after that. Dune Messiah, Herbert's second novel in this universe, it would make total sense as a third movie, because it completes Paul Atreides' arc. Villeneuve went on to say that he would want to make Part 2 as fast as possible, and then wait a few years until Timothée Chalamet gets a bit older to do the final instalment. In an interview in late December, Villeneuve also revealed that he's already writing the script for Part 3, Dune Messiah. Dune Messiah is being written now. The screenplay is almost finished, but it's not finished. It will take a little time. There's a dream of making a third movie. It would make absolute sense to me. So just like Part 2 wasn't announced when Dune Part 1 came out, even though it's not yet been announced, it's almost certain that Part 3 will be heading to our screens sometime in the future. Now I'd like to know, are you excited for Dune Part 2? Do you, like me, believe it could be one of the best sci-fi films ever? Or are you not interested by the movie and the possibility of a Part 3? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, then consider subscribing to the channel. I release videos every week covering the best films and shows around, as well as video essays like this one. If you really like the video, then the best way to support the channel and get involved with future videos is by becoming a member and joining Film Club. Thank you for watching, and see you again.